Good day. I'm Paul Colby. I've been with the Houston Urban Debate League from the beginning. I have mentored at several schools. I have given lectures at seminars, instructed at the summer camps, and I have judged at virtually every tournament for the last 10 years. I'm here today to speak with you about the 2019-2020 policy debate topic, which is, resolved, the United States federal government should substantially reduce direct commercial sales and/or foreign military sales of arms from the United States. Specifically, we're going to talk about what to do when you're on the affirmative. You may know that the United States is Earth's leading supplier of arms and has been for some time. Last year, the U.S. sold arms to 98 different nations. According to the Stockholm Peace Research Institute study of arms transfers from 2014 to 2018, others in the big leagues include Russia, who sold mostly armaments to India and China and Algeria, and France, who sold mostly armaments to Egypt and India and Saudi Arabia, and Germany, who sold mostly weapons to South Korea and Greece and Israel, and China, who mostly sold weapons to Pakistan and Bangladesh and Algeria. And you know what? China not only was the fifth largest exporter, but also the third largest importer. Let's look at the terms of the resolution. There are several items here I think that deserve scrutiny. First of all, the distinction between foreign military sales and direct commercial sales, if there is a distinction and if it is important. Secondly, the question of what substantial reduction means. And thirdly, the question of what arms are. What are arms? Okay? I think for now we can just avoid discussing United States federal government. If some affirmative team is able to find program or programs where a state or local government is selling arms to foreign countries, then congratulations, because I'm not sure what that would be at this point anyway. So go to the top, foreign military sales versus direct commercial sales. Foreign military sales are administered by the Department of Defense, but with final approval from the Department of State. These sales support cooperation between the U.S. and its allies. So you can think of them as government-to-government transactions. They account for about $43 billion annually. Direct commercial sales are different in that a purchaser, i.e. another government, consults directly with a manufacturer of arms and says what they need. When they reach a deal, when the manufacturer says, yeah, we can do that, then certain things come into play. Export licenses, attention to the U.S. munitions list, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations called ITAR, and the Export Administration Regulations, EAR. All of those things those are hurdles that have to be jumped, okay? But once that is done and a sale is made, you are talking about, say, $136 billion annually. Couple of notes. First of all, there are some foreign military sales, technically speaking, which are not really encompassed in this resolution because they have different names. The foreign military construction services, for example, or the sale of excess defense articles, EDA. You can argue whether those are implicitly covered under foreign military sales, but I think that's an area for further discussion and some debate. Other commercial sales would include items that are on the Commerce Department's list number 600. This includes, in addition to big deal things like tanks and anti-missile defense and so forth and so on, small firearms. And this is true because there was a movement during the Obama administration to take some things off the munitions list and put them on another list so that they could be sold with less regulation. Generally speaking, when you have either foreign military sales or direct commercial sales, the reality is that elements of the Defense Department, the State Department, and the Commerce Department are all going to be involved. Let's look at some examples. An affirmative says, we will reduce foreign military sales in this way. We will not sell F-35 fighter jets to Israel. Or, we will not sell Tomahawk missiles to Japan. Or, we will not sell XYZ to Qatar, pronounced Qatar by some folks, because we don't want the munitions to be transferred to another party, i.e. somebody hostile or somebody terrorist. An affirmative says, we will reduce direct commercial sales in this way. We won't sell drone technology to anybody. We won't sell, or we will restrict sales of small arms to nation states which violate human rights. Or, we will strengthen export controls because we want to prevent the resale of our technology. Or they say, we will not allow sales from Lockheed Martin to any foreign government. Pretty unlikely. But look at this page from Wikipedia on arms transfers. Are all these products of the arms industry, like ships, electronic systems, rangefinders, are all of those arms? An affirmative team might be successful in arguing that anything produced by the arms industry qualifies as arms. They might then decide we're going to pick one thing here that we want to substantially reduce the sale of. There is a gray area in modern parlance that is the area where the Commerce Department makes decisions, and that's called the dual use area. Dual use, it refers to something that can be used for military or peaceful purposes. That would include things like computers, electronics, navigation devices, aerospace, even some nuclear weapons components. That being said, however you want to define arms, we also need to talk about the term substantially reduce. So just reducing something doesn't get you all the way there with your affirmative burden. You have to do something that is significant. One way of deciding what is substantial is to look at dollars and cents. Reducing sales to any of the top buyers of U.S. arms would certainly be considered substantial. At summer camp this year, we looked at affirmatives that focused on number 1, Saudi Arabia, number 10, Taiwan, number 12, Israel. I don't mean to suggest that an affirmative built around reducing arms sales to Saudi Arabia or Taiwan or Israel is going to be a winner. What I suggest is that you will have fulfilled the burden of identifying a substantial reduction. Another way of looking at substantial reduction would be to talk about the sellers of arms. U.S. corporations dominate direct commercial sales of arms. So any reduction in the sales by Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, or General Dynamics constitutes substantial change. But frankly, a substantial policy change regarding arms sales is more about lining us up with our values than it is about looking at economics. It's stepping away from the current administration's policy of Buy American. Before we look at historic legislation and agreements to put the present administration's arms sales policy into context, let's talk for a moment about inherency. These days, many affirmative debaters spend next to no time discussing inherency. They say, here's what the situation is, here's what we're going to do about it. For a judge who is still responsive to inherency arguments, it should instead go this way. Here's what the situation is, here's why the status quo can't fix the problem, and here's what we're going to do about it. Now, I want to point out that this year you're off the hook if you don't want to talk much about inherency, because you have an inherent problem in the persona of Donald Trump. Take the situation regarding Saudi Arabian arms sales as an example. After the murder of journalist Khashoggi, there was a huge public outcry against our close relations with Saudi Arabia. That included outbursts from certain people in Congress, even on the president's team. Then, not much later, there was another outcry because the U.S. was seen as complicit in the Saudi war against Yemen. And there was such an outcry that there was a resolution in the Senate to stop those sales that contributed to that war against Yemen. So what did the president do? Well, he just decided he would go ahead with the arms sales he wanted to make, and he ignored Congress. He defied Congress. So you can say that in the person of Donald Trump and his administration, we have an inherent problem with arms sales, and we can't substantially reduce them as long as he's around. Let's look at some of the laws governing U.S. sales of arms, starting in 1961 with the Foreign Assistance Act. That separated military from non-military assistance, and some of the language of that act says, no assistance is to be provided to a government which engages in a pattern of gross violation of human rights. 1976, you had the Arms Export Control Act. That was what is the basis for the ITAR regulations we've discussed earlier. This gave the president the authority to control import and export of defense articles and services. Now, this act required that governments receiving weapons from the United States have to use them for legitimate self-defense. In 1979, we have the Export Administration Act. This gave the president legal authority to control exports for reasons of national security or foreign policy. In 2018, we finally have an Export Control Reform Act on the books. This is about adding certain emerging and foundational technologies to the export administration controls. In addition to these U.S. laws, there are some international agreements that affect our behavior with respect to sale of arms. In 1980, there was a UN Convention on certain conventional weapons, and this was a prohibition or restriction on the use of weapons deemed excessively injurious or having indiscriminate effects. In 2001, there was an action plan on illicit trade in small arms, which was adopted by the UN. This was a program to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all aspects. 2013, one of the most important, the Arms Trade Treaty adopted by the UN. This was an attempt to regulate international trade of conventional weapons. The U.S. signed on in September 2013, but did not ratify this agreement. And in 2019, the Trump administration announced that the U.S. was withdrawing its signature. Let's examine the mainstream ground for affirmatives under this year's resolution. Why should the U.S. substantially reduce its sales of arms? As we look into this, let's keep in mind the normative statements that are in domestic legislation and international declarations. So, area number 1, the U.S. should reduce arms sales because that is key to U.S. moral leadership. Argument is, the United States cannot credibly promote human rights if at the same time it is selling arms to nation states that don't play by the rules, that don't respect international law. So an affirmative using that premise could have an indictment of several countries or single out individual ones. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia in 2018 received about $4 billion worth of armaments from the United States and will probably receive maybe double that under Trump's latest planning for arms sales. What about behavior of the Saudi government? Less than admirable. You had an international outcry after the Khashoggi murder, but then you had a restored international and domestic response to the involvement of the United States in Saudi Arabia's war with Yemen. In fact, this is serious business. Just recently, here in September of 2019, the United Nations suggested that the U.S. and a couple of its allies are complicit in that war by proxy because we sold the weapons that caused so much damage to civilian populations. Another major violator of human rights is the State of Israel, which over the last decade has received roughly $3 billion in arms sales from the United States. Israel has been condemned by the international community repeatedly, 45 times, for example, in the United Nations Human Rights Council. But in every case, the U.S. bails them out because the U.S. is a member of the UN Security Council. That being said, Opinion about the state of Israel is slowly beginning to change in the United States, especially in recent weeks, because of the treatment of two congresswomen who were going to visit there. We talked earlier about the 5 American corporations which are among the top 10 commercial sellers of arms, and all of them have been involved in both Saudi Arabia and Israel. Lockheed, for example, sold the Saudis warships, warplanes, helicopters, and missiles. They sold the Israelis combat aircraft, helicopters, missiles, and munitions. Boeing sold the Saudis Apache and Chinook helicopters, F-15 jets, and AWACS aircraft. They sold the Israelis F-15 fighters and Apache helicopters. Raytheon, another big player in the Middle East, sold the Saudis Paveway 4 bombs and Patriot missiles. They sold the Israelis electronic systems for radar and bunker busters. Northrop sold its longbow system to both the Saudis and the Israelis. General Dynamics sold the Saudis armored vehicles and bombs. They sold the Israelis bombs. Let's move on now to a second group of possible affirmatives, and they would fall under this banner. We need to substantially reduce arms sales because that is a key to American security. Usually, arms sales are justified as promoting U.S. security, but in the real world, things often work out quite differently. For example, heightened tensions are often the result of U.S. arms sales to, for example, Taiwan, which China considers part of China. So every time the United States provides offensive or defensive weapons to Taiwan, the Chinese are rankled. International tensions go way high. All right? Secondly, though, as a general proposition, anytime we have an arms sale to one nation, you are probably going to have blowback in that terrorists will be emboldened, or opponents of the government will be emboldened, or factions will be emboldened. If they don't get weapons from us, they'll probably get them from the Russians or the Chinese. In fact, the U.S. often gets linked into conflicts that are ongoing in certain regions of the world on the basis of its arms sales. And what it does is to escalate an arms race that wouldn't have been escalated had we not sold weapons there. Finally, think about the fact that the U.S., having sold so many weapons to so many countries, often finds in some regional conflict that American-made or American-sold weapons are being used against American troops. That's not really promoting our security, is it? A third potential approach for affirmatives is along these lines. Reduction of arms sales is a key to protecting our technology and strengthening export controls. The issue here is sometimes when we sell arms or components to some country with a stipulation that they can't let anybody else see that technology, it simply gets sold to the highest bidder regardless of what the law says or the agreement for exporting says. And therefore, our technology gets out of our hands and into the hands of others. While we're on the subject of technology, let's look at an avenue for affirmatives that does not involve a specific country, necessarily, that does not involve a company that makes or sells armaments necessarily, but instead is after outlawing one particular weapon of war, and it's a modern one, and it's drones. Drones are sort of a clinical version of walking on the battlefield because you don't actually have to be on a battlefield to use drones. You're probably sitting behind a desk looking at a monitor, pressing a button, and sending a weapon out that is supposed to hit a particular target with precision, even if it's thousands of miles away. What we know from all sorts of news reporting is that drones are not that precise, and that often as not, the casualties from drone warfare are innocent civilians. It's for that reason that we should stop using them, some would say, and we should stop selling drones to other nations that would use them because of the effects. It's hard to calculate even how many civilian deaths there are. They were the subject of much discussion under the Obama administration, and now with the Trump administration, there is an attempt to cover up any information about how many civilian deaths there actually are. In conclusion, I do have some thoughts about other possible off-the-reservation affirmatives, but we can save that for another time. We're just trying to get started right now. Also, I did not explore all of the particular situations that exist in particular countries, because we would be here all afternoon if we did that. Okay? And we don't really, and you probably don't want to listen for more than a half hour anyway. You need to go outside and get some exercise. But that being said, when you decide on an affirmative this year, if you use the evidence for a summer camp or if you write it all yourself, remember to keep an eye on some news program or a couple of them if you can, so that you are always up to date with what is going on in this big political world of ours, because things do change sometimes overnight, and especially under this administration, things change all the time, it seems like. So I hope this is useful in getting you thinking about where you want to go on the affirmative, and probably I can update you at some point later in the year and in maybe some other format with some of the better sources I've come across for information, or with some tips on what to do about a certain affirmative that you encounter, etc., etc. But for now, I hope this helped, and I hope you have a great year debating. Thanks for listening.